Hello. Okay, today we're going to talk about Gestalt therapy. And this is a therapy model that's credited mostly to names on the board are Fritz and Laura Perls. Fritz gets the majority of the credit for the development and bringing the theory to the US and its enactment. Laura is his wife, and depending on which publications you read, she was helpful to, she was an integral part of the theory. However, Fritz generally tends to get credit for it. If you also see the name Frederick Perls written somewhere, Frederick Perls tends to be one and the same as Fritz Perls, so I know sometimes that's confusing. So Fritz or Frederick and Laura are the founders. Gestalt therapy, the Perls started their theory and were strongly influenced when they were living in Europe and studying under the Gestalt psychologists. And Gestalt psychology, for those of you who've had introductory or general psychology classes, is a psychology based on the idea of wholeness. And the classic sort of statement to appreciate what Gestalt psychology is about is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And Gestalt psychology in part was a reaction to a very strong movement in psychology at the time, which was psychological learning theory and behaviorism, which really was a very mechanistic view of putting itty-bitty little pieces of behavior together, as we talk about in this class in behaviorism. So the Gestaltists kind of reacted to this, and they said, you know, a behavior is not just, you know, a big complex behavior like language, or a complicated behavior like building a house or like riding a bicycle, is not just a linear addition of a lot of little pieces of a puzzle all put together. In order to understand behavior, you need to look at the whole thing, that the whole transcends each of the pieces. And a couple analogies of that would be that a chocolate chip cookie transcends flour plus butter plus sugar plus leavener plus chocolate chips. If you eat each of those individually over the course of an hour, you've not eaten a chocolate chip cookie. You put them all together, you cook them, you stick them in the oven, you cook them, and something magical happens. You create a chocolate chip cookie. So that's kind of like Gestalt psychology, that the whole big thing is more than the sum of all of these little itty-bitty pieces. So taking that, and that was studying sort of learning behavior, the Gestalt psychologists, Perls took that model and applied it to psychotherapy and to working with humans. Perls emigrated to the US around World War II time and did much of his writing. He was trained, as the story goes for most everyone in this class, trained as an analyst, frustrated by his work in analysis and by what just didn't seem to fit him and didn't seem to be working as well for his clients as it could be. And consequently, took these learnings from the Gestalt psychologist, took his experiences, and created this model called Gestalt therapy. He was, again, if you look at people as a product of their time, much of the work that he did was in the late 50s through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. Those of you who've lived through that era, or those of you who have read American history or listened to popular music, know that the 1960s in America was a very definitive time period. And if you want to gain an understanding of Gestalt therapy and gain an understanding of Perls, it would really behoove you to read some of his first-hand writings, in which you get to see the language that he uses, in which his personality kind of comes out through his pen or his keyboard. And he really has a very strong, powerful personality. And when you read him, you get that far more than you do in any textbook. He was a product, and his therapy was occurring at the time of encounter movements. And encounter groups, for those of you who aren't aware of what they were these groups where people would come together, often for a very intensive experience. So you might have a number of people who were regular outpatient, hour-per-week clients, or people would just come together, do, as a result of a newspaper ad. But they would come together to a location, and Fritz was working in California for much of his life, and they would meet on Friday, and they would leave on Sunday, and oftentimes there was very little sleep. Since it was the 60s, sometimes there were mind-altering substances and ingestibles that some of the group members might or might not partake in, but it was this huge consciousness-raising movement, and Gestalt therapy was used. There are some encounter groups that used Rogerian models, so Gestalt was not the only model that was running encounter groups, but Pearls was doing some encounter groups. So the main idea that comes out of Gestalt therapy is really developing in clients a sense of awareness, a sense of appreciation for the here and now, which is where I am right here and what's going on around me right now. All I have from the past are memories, and all I have of the future is kind of looking ahead. But where I am right now is where I need to be. And so there was this strong movement on appreciating the here and the now, and not troubling yourself too much with what happened yesterday, or concerning yourself too horribly with worry and fear about what was going to happen tomorrow, but just experiencing. It's a very experiential kind of model. And some phrases that are used are how and now. So a Gestalt therapist would ask you if you're saying, right now I'm feeling very tender. And a Gestalt therapist would say, now, how are you feeling? I'm feeling very tender. I'm feeling very angry. I'm really just feeling kind of bored. How are you experiencing that? And the Gestalt therapist would really help the client get in touch with the how. How is it that you know that you're feeling very tender and sensitive, or that you're feeling very angry, or that you're feeling very bored? What bodily symptoms, what body posture, what physiology and physiological sensations do you notice that allow you to appreciate and be aware of how you're feeling right here and now? So the focus is on present experiences. It's on helping people to be who they truly, really are. So that if you look at an object relations perspective of one's false self versus one's true self, Gestalt therapy wants us to be our true self, the person that we are meant to be, and not sort of phony, artificial, facade-wearing, people-pleasing folks. Again, much of this transcends all of therapy, helping us to really get in touch with who we are and helping us to be who we really are. At the same time, a lot of it really makes even more sense when you put it in the context of time and place, that this really very much was in the 1960 encounter movement where people were just being who they were. So anyhow, that's kind of a broad overview. What are some of the pieces of the puzzle and understandings of Gestalt therapy? I have up here a list of 5 key characteristics, and I believe these come from a publication by English in 1958, but I didn't reference as well as I could have when I took these notes, and I think that that's where it comes from. Anyway, so these are some of the kind of main tenets that the Gestalt therapy movement sort of is built upon. One, this idea, and these come out of Gestalt therapy, that people tend to seek closure. What closure means is that we don't like unfinished business. We don't like things being left undone. And there's kind of this idea that if something is left undone in your life, it pricks at you, and it bugs you, and it nags at you. And it always takes a little bit of psychic energy to remember. So if you didn't pay a bill, or you have an incomplete, hanging out in a class, and every time you see that teacher, it's him or it's her, and oh, I have an incomplete in that class, and it just eats at you. We like closure. We like things to start to have a life and then to come to a natural ending. So we like to bring closure to things. And sometimes perceptually, we will see closure. There's an experiment in psychology where they'll show people very briefly a picture of a circle that looks like that, and they'll just flash it really quickly and then turn it off. And they'll ask people what they saw, and most people will see a completed circle. We tend to like closure, and we tend to artificially impose it in places where we don't have enough time to realize that it's not necessarily there. A person will complete gestalts according to their needs. What this says is that if we have something which is an incomplete circle, or a picture that doesn't quite make a lot of sense, that we will bring something to that, and the way that we will make sense of it, or the way that we will complete the picture, I may do it differently from the way that any of you watching this video may do it, and I may do it differently today at 9 a.m. than how I would do it tomorrow at 4 p.m., depending on what my needs are at this time. The Gestalt movement talks some about the Rorschach Inkblot test, and although they're not big into doing lots of psychodynamic interpretation of testing and so forth, the Rorschach Inkblot test is a test where you show people these ink blots, which aren't anything other than ink smushed on a page, squished together, and you open it up and you have this symmetry of ink blots. And how something like people completing gestalts according to their needs, you look at these nebulous pictures, and what they find is that if people are hungry, they'll see French fries in the picture. If you show the same person that picture at a time when they've just had a big meal, the picture won't necessarily look like French fries. It might look like, a wonderful soft couch with pillows on it to lie on. Maybe that's because they're so full, all they want to do is lie down and relax. They'll finish the picture according to what their needs or what their pushes are, which means we bring to a sort of nebulous situation things in our head, and then we sort of project or impose them onto the situation according to what the pull in ourself is. We've already talked about a person's behavior is a whole, which is greater than the sum of its component parts. One of the examples that they use for this is the idea that if you look at a piece of paper with words on it, if you look at this, here is a G and an E and an S and a T, A, L, T, S. But once you learn how to read, we almost never just look at a series of letters put together in a word in our language that we read and understand. We don't see that as a combination of letters. It's a word, and it's very hard to see that as just a combination of letters instead of a word. So much so that they've done studies where they'll just show people words which are sort of scrambled up and have all the vowels missing. And again, if you flash it quickly, people will swear they saw a word. If you misspell a word, oftentimes you don't even catch it because your brain just tells you the word instead of reading each individual letter. Behavior is the same thing. It's not just a little collection of pieces. Who we are as a person is greater than the sum of just what I'm doing now, what I'll do in 2 minutes, what I'll do 2 minutes later, all sums together at the end of the night. This moves down into this. Behavior can only be meaningfully understood in a context. That means in order to understand what somebody's doing, you need to look at where it is that they're doing it. If, for example, you were to look at, let's say, you were to go into a locker room, and you were to see people coming in, taking off their street clothes, changing, putting on a bunch of, gym shorts and t-shirts and sneakers and leaving. If the context was a locker room, this would make a lot of sense. If, on the other hand, you walk into a classroom, or you walk into your office, or you walk into a business meeting dressed in a suit, you sit down and you start undressing and putting on sneakers and socks and gym shorts and a t-shirt, people will look at you and think you are really very, very weird. So behavior which makes perfect sense at the gym does not at all fit when you are in a meeting or conference at the office. You can only understand behavior in a context. As you work clinically with clients, this is really important to appreciate. When we look at some of the things that clients do, they look destructive, they look incomprehensible, they look nutty, and yet at the same time, if you understand either where the client is currently or where the client was when he or she was growing up, some of those same behaviors, which are just sort of horrible now and absolutely, continually kick themselves in the teeth, that's what perhaps they had to do when they were growing up in order to survive in their family. So while perhaps a temper tantrum is not the way to get your needs met in your job as an adult, perhaps when you were a young kid, a temper tantrum was the only way that you would be noticed in your family. So you want to look at behavior in context, and when you're talking with your clients, you want to look at the context of their life and the context of their circumstances. This idea here, we experience our world according to principles. Actually, this should probably be principles, as my perfectionism comes out, of figure and ground. And what the ideas of figure and ground mean, and you'll read this in the text and you'll read this in most books which talk about Gestalt therapy. So let me kind of see if I can understand, if I can make this clear. Figure and ground is if you look at a picture, and in intro psych classes and other psych classes, some of you may have had those pictures where it's sort of the black and the white and the picture can switch, the sort of, visual imagery, sort of tricky pictures where, there's one that's the profile of two faces looking at each other, and then there's a goblet in between, so you have two white faces sort of looking at each other on the outsides of a picture, and then on the white, or the black on the inside, you have a goblet. Well, if you're looking at the faces, you see faces. But if your brain kind of does the switch, suddenly you see the goblet in the middle and then you don't see the faces. And then your brain does the switch again and you see the faces and you don't see the goblet. Or there's one where if you look at the picture one way, there's an old woman wearing kind of a scarf. If you look at it another way, there's a beautiful young lady. So, and it depends on which you're looking at. Well, the one you're looking at, the one your brain is focusing on, is the figure. The rest of it is the ground. If I'm looking at this classroom and I'm looking over there and I see the overhead projector, that is the figure. The ground may be behind the window where I see a bunch of vertical blinds and I see a tree and a blue sky. But the figure that I'm focusing on, my camera would be focusing on, would be the overhead projector. Now I could do the same thing. I'm sitting here in class, I'm bored, I'm staring out the window and I'm looking at the beautiful sunny warm day and the trees which are just budding with new leaves. And I don't even really notice the overhead projector. It's just kind of this blur in my vision. Suddenly I have switched, and what was the figure, the thing I was focusing on, has now become the ground. It's the background, and I'm focusing on the tree outside. So there's kind of this switching of figure and ground. It's where my attention is focused and the background. And it's where my attention is focused in the background. You're in a party, and there's a group of people over here having a conversation, a group of people over here. And they're both kind of interesting conversations. So you tune into this one, that becomes ground. Then you hear your name over here. You tune into this one, that becomes ground, and back and forth and back and forth. Anyhow, the Gestalt therapists write a lot, talk a lot about this idea of figure and ground, and that we keep kind of switching where our focus, where our attention is. So those are some of the basic kind of concepts, constructs of this model. As you bring this into a Gestaltian understanding of human behavior, there are a few things which Pearls talks about in terms of understanding human beings. One of the big ideas that he addresses are these things called layers of neurosis. And I also have down here defenses, and we'll get to those in a minute. But this idea of layers of neurosis really is very Pearlsian, very much kind of gives you an appreciation of his perspective and of this model. The idea and the metaphor that the Gestalt therapist uses is the metaphor of an onion. And what you do when you come to therapy is you come because, either because you have a bunch of symptoms which are driving you or the people who you know crazy, or you just don't feel real. You just feel like life is kind of going by and And you know, there you are, you're 20 or you're 30, you're 40, you're 50, and life is out there and you just kind of don't feel like you're a part of it. It looks like everybody else is having fun and you're just sort of left out and you feel like you're going through the motions of life, but you're not really sinking your teeth in and living it. So what Gestalt therapy would say is that you're this onion, and the true you is inside the core of that onion. But there's all of these layers of neurosis, these problems, or these fake walls that you have built, separating yourself from, or separating you from the world, your true self from the world. And so what therapy does is it peels back these layers so that the true you can come out. You can have true contact. Contact is real, honest connection with other people, where the true you is in touch with the true them. So the outside layer, if we have a picture of an onion. So if this is our onion, and you know, these are our different layers as we start peeling it. Our outermost layer of the onion is our phony layer. This is the facade that we put on. It's our fake sense of self. It's the persona that we bring to the world. So, and all of us have this to some extent. So you wake up, you just don't feel good, and you know, you have a cruddy morning, nothing goes right, you arrive at school or you arrive at work and you just want to go back to bed and, you know, push rewind and start the day over, and a coworker comes down the hall or a friend comes down the hall and says, "Hi, how you doing?" You say, "Fine." That's the phony me. I'm not going to tell you my true self, I'm just going to present this inauthentic self because it's easier, because it's socially acceptable and so forth. If you peel this layer of the onion away, you get to your phobic layer. The phobic layer is where you're a little more in touch with stuff, but you're aware of the fact that the world is scary. That if I get really in touch with my true self, I'm vulnerable. You know, there's a tender little core in here. And this is uncomfortable. So it's kind of a neurotic sense of, oh my goodness, there really is more to life, but do I absolutely want to go there? And as we move through the phobic layer, people will hit an impasse. An impasse is like a wall. Uh-oh, I'm stuck. And in the impasse, we feel like, I just can't go any further. I don't have the energy to go further. I can't keep drilling on towards that core of the earth, or that center of the onion. And oftentimes, Pearl says at this point in time, we just kind of feel blah. We sort of feel dead. The next layer is the implosive layer. And in the implosive layer, we finally sort of made contact with ourself, our true person, who we are. And then the implosive is sort of an inner focus thing. And once we've hit the implosive, if we go beyond this, we explode. We become our true self. And if you look at Pearl's, there's a series of tapes from the 1950s, I think it is, called the Gloria tapes, which shows Fritz Perls, Albert Ellis, and Carl Rogers all doing therapy with this woman, Gloria. So it's the same client, and she just goes up, and all three of these guys work with her. And it's a lovely demonstration of the personality and color of each of those three practitioners. Well, you know, Pearls is just kind of like this explosive, you know, kind of, you can see him doing this explosive kind of thing, but you're your true self and you're real, and this is, you know, who you are. This absolutely fits into the model of the 1960s and the encounter movement and so forth and so on. So anyway, as you go through each of these layers, you get closer and closer to becoming your true self, the person who you really are. And at the explosive layer, you're not only in touch with your true self and aware, you also share that self with